JavaScript's dynamic typing makes the language incredibly flexible. That flexibility comes at a cost. Because any variable can potentially be of any type, it's easy to inadvertently introduce runtime type errors into an application. We can, and often do, alleviate this by adding conditional checks throughout our code to handle such cases, but this leads to bloated code that can be hard to follow. The maybe data type allows us to encapsulate the defensive coding needed to avoid such errors, keeping our application code focused on the task at hand. In this course, we'll look at the maybe type in action. We'll be relying on the maybe exposed by the Crocs library, but the core concepts and much of the API translates to other implementations. This course starts with an overview of the maybe type and its underlying types, the just and the nothing. We'll cover various approaches for constructing this data type, and learn how to apply transformations to data within the safe confines of a maybe. We'll also cover the point for utility functions provided by Crocs that let us build up function compositions for working with our maybes. After completing this course, you'll have the tools and knowledge needed to add some safety to your JavaScript with declarative code that can be easily composed while avoiding the unnecessary noise of sprinkling imperative conditional statements throughout your code. Here we have a utility file where we're exporting a few simple utility functions. The inc function accepts a number, returns the result of incrementing that value by 1. We're pulling increment into our index.js file with require, and currently we're just taking the input value of 2, applying the increment function to it, and logging the result. As we can see from our output, this is working fine, and we're getting a result of 3. If I were to change this to another number, like 4, we'll see the result will be 5, 8 will yield 9, so everything's working as expected. The problems start when we turn this into a string, and then we start to see weird, unexpected results. So passing 8 as a string here is going to yield 81. Because that plus operator then becomes concatenation because it's operating on strings. If we change this to undefined, we're going to see that our result is not a number. So to avoid these unexpected results, we just need to make sure that we always call increment with a number. So let's do that in kind of a simplistic way. So let's check type of input and see if that is equal to number. And if it is, we'll call increment. And if it's not, we'll just return 0 here. So now we'll see when we pass undefined in, our result is 0. So this works, but it's not ideal. Our code is a little bit harder to read now, and we don't want to have to do this every time we call a function that expects a number. We could avoid this by moving the type checking code into the increment function, but that only works for code that we have control of. If this function came from some third-party module, that wouldn't really make the most sense. So let's pull the maybe data type into our project and see how we can use that to provide some safety for this function. So in my terminal, I'm going to install the Crocs library with npm i-s crocs. And with that installed, we come back into our code and I'm going to import Crocs. So I'll import const maybe, and that's going to equal require Crocs / maybe. So maybe is an object that's going to wrap our value, and it's going to let us differentiate between values that we want to act on and values that we don't want to act on. And this works because maybe is a union type, meaning it's made up of 2 underlying types, and it can be one of those at a time. It's made up of either a just that holds a value, which we'll call x here, or a nothing. So just represents a value that we want to act on, and nothing will represent something that we don't want to act on. So let's take a look at this in action so we can get a better understanding of it. So let's replace our input, and we're going to do that by calling maybe.just to construct a just with a value in it. And we'll give that 2. And then I'm going to replace this result line using maybe. So input is an object, so we're going to have some methods on this. So one of those methods is map, and map is what's going to allow us to apply whatever value is in that just to a function. So we can pass inc into map, and we'll see that our result now is a just of 3. So what happened was we wrapped up our 2 in this maybe, and then when we called map on it to apply to that function, the maybe unwrapped the value, got the 2 out, passed it into inc, which is expecting that number, got back the result 3, and wrapped it back up in the just for us. So now that we know this is working, let's change our code up just a little bit. And what I want to do is I just want to extend the function that we're passing into map so that we can log out anytime we call inc. So I'm going to accept a number here, And I'm going to pass that into ink, so we'll still get our result back. But before that, I'm going to add a console.log, and I'm just going to point out that we're calling ink, and because console log returns an undefined, we can just OR to get the call to our function. So we'll still end up with our return value for ink, but we have a nice, neat way to just log out that our function's being called. So I'm going to save this, and then in the terminal, I'm just going to run this by pointing to my folder with Node, and we'll see that it's calling ink, and then we get our result. So now that we have this logging code in place, let's see what happens if we change our input, and instead of passing it a just of 2, we pass it a nothing. The nothing constructor is going to get no value because it represents nothing. And we'll see down here our result is a nothing. And if we save this file and then we run this in the terminal, we'll see that we're going to get our nothing back. We didn't get our console log for calling ink because it actually just skipped mapping over that function. So if we have a just with our value, it's going to invoke that function that we passed to map. And if we have a nothing, it's not going to invoke the function. This means all we have to do is properly wrap our value based on whether it's a valid argument for our function or not, and we'll be safe from unexpected results. So let's create a function, and I'm going to call this safenum. And safenum is going to take in some value, and then we're going to decide if we want it to be a just of that value or a nothing. So we'll do this based on whether or not it's a number. So I can just take this out of our old result line, and we'll check the type of val instead of input this time. And if it's a number, we're going to construct a just wrapping our value. Otherwise, we'll just return a nothing. And now we can come down here, we can just clean up this incomplete code in the comment, and then our input is going to be a call to safenum passing in our value. So if we pass in a 2, we'll see that our result is a just of 3. If we pass in a 5, we'll get just of 6. And if we pass in undefined, we'll get nothing. And if we pass in some string, we also get nothing. Empty array, object literal. All of these things are going to skip over our function that expects a number and just yield us a nothing. Using the maybe type, we've added an element of safety to a function without having to change that original function. Here, we're importing 2 utility functions, ink and toUpper. We've also pulled in the maybe type from Crocs, and we're using a function called safenum to take in a value and return a maybe. We'll get a just wrapping our value if it's a number, and a nothing otherwise. We're using map on our maybe to call increment, and this will run safely because any value that isn't a number will result in a nothing, and our function won't be invoked. We also have a set of input and results using our toUpper utility, where we're pulling in the value test, we're converting it to uppercase, and then down at the bottom we're logging out both the result n for our number example and result s for our string example. And you'll notice that in our number example, our result is a just of 6, and if I were to change this to a non-number value, say an empty array, we're going to get back nothing. So that's safely running over ink. We're not getting nan or any kind of weird unexpected value. Where down here, we're taking our string and we're getting a string out, which is great right up until we pass this, a number. And then we're going to see that toUppercase is not a function. So we'd like to be able to make this safe. So what we're going to do is we'll come up here and we can declare a new function. So we'll call this one safe string. And this is going to take in a value, just like our other one did. And then we're going to check our type of on val, and we'll see if that equals a string. If it does, then we're going to return that wrapped in a just. So we'll call maybe.just with our value. Otherwise, we'll return maybe.nothing. So now I'm going to come down here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take whatever value is being passed in for our input, and I'm going to wrap that as a maybe. So I'm going to call safe string on my value here. And then I need to update this to call map. So we'll call input_s.map, passing in our toUpper function. So now we'll see down in our result, we're going to get just with our capitalized string. And if I were to change this to say a 5, we'll get a nothing. Now we have two different functions that will take two different types and wrap them up in maybes, and that's great, except every time we need to create a new maybe based on a different condition, we're going to have to create one of these functions. So let's see if we can make this a little more generic. So I'm going to start by defining a function called isNumber, and isNumber is going to take in a value and it's going to return the result of checking its type. So I'm just going to copy this, paste that in there. I'm going to do the same thing for isString. So we'll take in a value, check its type, and return the resulting Boolean. All right, so now that we have these defined, let's create a generic utility that will take in one of these predicate functions and return our maybe. So I'll define another constant. I'm just going to call this one safe. And safe is going to be a function that takes in a predicate function and a value. And all we're going to do here is we're going to call the predicate on the value, and based on the result of that, we'll return either a just or a nothing. So if it results to true, we have the type of value we want. We'll wrap that up in a just. Otherwise, we'll just call the nothing constructor and return a nothing. So with that created, let's get rid of these safenum and safeString functions because we won't need those anymore. And I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to call safe to get my number, and I'm going to pass it isNumber as its predicate function. And then I'll do the same thing for the string, calling safe isString and then passing in my string value. And we'll see that if I change my number to a non-number, I'll get the nothing in the result. And if I change my string to something that's not a string, say a number, we'll get a nothing in the result for that one. So everything's working the way we expect it to. This approach to creating a maybe is standard enough that the Crocs library actually provides this safe and these predicate functions for us. So I can come up here and I can import safe, and that'll just be from require, and we'll require that from crocs/maybe/safe. And then we can get rid of our safe function here, and everything will continue to work. And I can also pull in two predicates. So we'll pull in isNumber, and that'll be from require, and that'll come from crocs/predicates isNumber. And then we're also going to have the string version of that. So we'll have isString, and that's going to come from isString. So I can take care of these, and we'll see we still get our results. So we can clean this code up. As an added bonus, this version of safe is curried, which means we can pass it a single argument and get back a function that'll wait for that second argument. So I could go back to using a function called safenum, but I can create that using safe, passing it isNumber. So now I have this reusable function. So if I find myself calling safe with the same predicate multiple times, I can just do this and then reuse that wherever I need it. And now I also have a function that can be used easily in a composition where it's just waiting for that single value as a result of the previously invoked function. We have a function defined that takes a number, and then using the utility functions we've pulled in, increments it, and then doubles the result of that and returns the value. We're passing in a 2 and we're getting the expected result of 6. But if we were to pass in something that's not a number, such as 2 as a string, we're going to start to get unexpected results. In this case, we get a 42 because our value ends up being coerced to a string, concatenated, and then coerced back to a number in our multiplication step. If we change the value to something that's not coercible into a number, then we're going to get not a number as our result. Let's use a maybe inside this function to avoid these unexpected results. We'll come up here and we've already imported safe and isNumber. So I'm going to start by defining a constant. We'll call it safenum, and we're going to call safe with isNumber, and then we're going to pass in that number value that's been passed into this function. And now to apply our increment function to the value, we're going to call safenum.map, passing in that increment function. And then we want to apply double, so we can map again, passing in double. And then we want this to be our return value, so we'll get rid of these, and we'll just return safenum with our 2 calls to map. And we'll see that our result is right, except that our number is still wrapped up in a just. So rather than returning our maybe, we need to unwrap this value and return that so that all of our consuming code can continue to work with numbers like it was. To do that, after map, we're going to add a call to option. And the option method is going to take a default value. And this default value is going to be returned in the case of a nothing. Otherwise, it's just going to unwrap the value from our just and return that. So since we're dealing with numbers, a nice safe default would be 0. So we'll pass that 0. We'll see that our result has updated to 6. So it's been unwrapped from the just. And now we can just pass in an invalid value and just verify that we get back our default value of 0. So that's working. So let's clean up these comments. And then we really don't need to assign this to a variable. So what we could do is take safenum out of the equation here. And then just put these maps on safe. And then if we really wanted to remove some more noise from our code, we could get rid of the curly braces. And now we don't need the return statement either. And we could take this refactoring one step further. We have two maps here. So what's going to happen is our maybe is going to go into the first map. It's going to see that there's a just with a value. It'll unwrap it, call inc, rewrap it, and then go to the next map. And it's going to go through that same process again. So what we can do is we can save the work of unwrapping that value twice by turning these two functions into a single function composition and then passing that into map. So to do that, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to import compose. And I can pull that right out of the crocs library through crocs/helpers/compose. And then what I can do is I can compose here and we can say that we call double after inc. Get rid of that second map. And we'll see that we still have our expected result, but now we're only unwrapping and rewrapping that value one time. Here we have an object that represents a query string for paged records. We're getting the page property from the object and passing that into our increment utility to get the next page. As we can see, the page property on the query string object has a value of 2, and after calling inc on that value, we get back a 3. This works fine right up until that object gets sent to us without that page property, and then we're going to get not a number. Let's use a maybe type to avoid this unexpected result. I'm going to come up here to the top and I'm going to pull in the safe utility from crocs. So that'll be require croc/maybe/safe. As safe is going to require a predicate function, so I'm going to pull in a couple utilities from Ramda so that we can build up the predicate that we need. So I'll pull in compose is nil and not, and those are all going to come in from the Ramda library. And then I'm going to create a new function, which I'm going to call is not nil. And then I'm going to set that to equal compose, and I'm just going to compose and say that we're going to call not after is nil. And now I have a predicate that I can use for safe. So I'll come down here and we'll call safe with our is not nil predicate, passing in qs.page. And then we'll see down here we're going to get an object. So let's take inc off of here and just make sure we're getting the object we expect, and we're getting a nothing. So if I come up here and I put this page property back on the object and I give it a value, you're going to see we'll get a just of that value. So everything's working. So now in order to get the next page, we'll actually call this page.map. We'll map that over inc. And we'll get a just of 4. And then we want to unwrap that. So we'll use option and we'll give it a default value of 1. And we'll get out just the 4. And then if we go back to our object, we remove that property altogether, we'll get that default value of 1. So now that we have this working, let's take it one step further and create a generic utility that we can use to grab a property off of any object in a safe manner. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to define prop. And this is going to be our utility function. So we're going to accept a property name, which we'll call prop name, and an object. And then in our function, we're going to call safe using our is not nil predicate. And then we're just going to reference that object and we're going to grab its prop name. And this will pull the property off of the object. And if it's not nil, it'll give us a just wrapping the value that was in that property. And if it is, we'll get back a nothing. So we can make sure this works by replacing our call to safe down here with a call to our new prop utility, passing in page as our property name and QS as our object. we'll see down here we still get our default of 1. And if I update the object up here, have a page property with a value, then we're going to get that incremented value. This is a fairly common use of the maybe type. So Crocs actually comes with its own prop utility. So let's pull that in. So I'm going to pull in const prop, and that's going to equal a call to require, passing in Crocs / maybe / prop. And then we can comment out our implementation of prop, and we can also comment out our imports from Ramda and our is not nil predicate. So you see down here, everything's still working as it was because the Crocs implementation of prop is going to do the same thing for us. So if I come down here and I get the page property off of this object, we'll see that we still get a nothing resulting in our default value. And the added benefit to using the Crocs implementation, aside from the fact that you don't have to implement it yourself, is that it's curried, which means I can come up here and I can call it with one argument, just the property name, and I get this reusable function that it's just waiting for an object. So now I can come down here and I can call save page, passing in query string, and everything will work as expected. And if I wanted to use this on multiple objects that had a page property, I could just reuse this save page function wherever I needed it. I have an example user object, and I'm just using standard dot notation to get the user's postal code from the nested address object. We're getting a value, but it's possible that this property could be missing from our object. So if I were to come up here and change this just by renaming it, we'll see down here that we get undefined. So what we want to do in the case where we don't get the postal code is return some kind of a default value. So I can do this with just an or, and I can say not available. And we'll see that in the case where postal code doesn't exist, we're going to get that not available string. Otherwise, we'll get our postal code. The real problems start if our address isn't available. So if I come up here and I rename this just so it's not a valid piece of that path, we'll see that we're going to get a type error that it cannot read the property postal code of undefined. So the problem here is we have an undefined in the middle of our path, which is actually going to throw an exception rather than just give us an undefined. This is a little harder to recover from. So we're going to reach for a maybe. So what we'll do is we'll import a utility from the Crocs library, which is called proppath, and we'll get that with require Crocs / maybe / proppath. And then we'll update this. We'll get rid of our or here. We'll save this. And then what we'll do is we're going to call proppath, and we're going to pass it the path we want within the property as an array of strings, and then the object that we want. So the object that we're going to take this from is going to be user, and then our path is going to be address, followed by postal code. We'll see that we get a just with our postal code. If I come up here and I get rid of that, we're going to get a nothing. And if I come up here and I get rid of address, we're also going to get a nothing. So we've avoided our type error. So now all we have to do to use our default value in either one of those cases is come down here and call option to unwrap our value, and we'll give it a default for the case where we have a nothing. And we'll see that we're getting our zip code. And then if I take address out of the equation, we get not available. And if address is there, but it doesn't have postal code, we get not available again. And just like the other utilities in Crocs, this is curried, so we can take the first portion of this, and we can break it out into its own reusable function. So we'll define get postal code, and we'll set that to equal a call to proppath with just the array of properties for our path. And then we can come down here and we can call our get postal code function, passing in user, and then calling option on that, and everything will continue to work as expected. But now we have this reusable function that we can apply to multiple objects. In this file, we have a stub service function. In a real app, this would make a call to an API, but in this example, we'll just use this hard-coded result value as the API response. Our function uses the prop utility from Crocs to return a maybe, that wraps the result's body property. In our index.js, we import this getUser function, and then we're calling it, and we're just running console.log on the then. If I save this file and open the terminal, I can run it, and we'll see that our promise resolves to a just of an object. The object that's wrapped in our just is the body property from our result. So if we go back to the other file, we're going to see that we have a just of this object. And what we want to do in our consuming code is actually just get the postal code for this user. So we're going to come back over here, and I'm going to import a utility from Crocs called proppath. And we'll use require for this, and we'll grab croc/maybe/proppath. Then we'll come down here, and I'm going to add then before our console log in our promise chain, and I'm going to take the result that I get back, which is a just of our value. So we're going to use map to invoke a function on it. And the function I want to invoke is going to be a call to proppath that's going to have our path predefined. So I'm going to jump up here, and I'm going to create a new function, and I'll call it getPostalCode. And that's going to be a call to proppath, and we're going to define our path. We're going to leave the data argument off of it. So we're just going to look for address and then postal code. And now we can pass get postal code into map. We'll save this, and back in our terminal, we'll run this again. And you'll see this time we get our zip code back, but we get a just, and our zip code. So what we've essentially done is taken our maybe, we've unwrapped the value, we've gotten a new maybe by running this call to proppath, and then we rewrapped it in another maybe. So now we have a nested maybe. Working with nested types like this is going to get really cumbersome, especially if we start nesting even more levels deep. But this is not uncommon, so there's an easy solution for this. We can replace map with chain, and chain is essentially flat map. So it'll apply our function, but it'll also deal with flattening out that nested structure. So if I save this and I go back into the terminal and run this again, you'll see that this time we're only getting one maybe rather than a maybe nested inside of another maybe. We're importing Crocs as a whole and then using destructuring to grab several of its functions, as well as the maybe type. We also have a couple of utilities being pulled in from the random library, and we have three functions already defined. IsNonEmptyString is a predicate function that checks that a value is both a string and that it contains some characters. CreateURLSlug will take in a string, convert it to lowercase, and replace the spaces with dashes. And finally, CreateURL takes in a slug and appends it to the end of our base URL. Our goal is to take this article object and get a URL that contains the name as a slug, and we want to do this all within the safe confines of the maybe type. Let's start by collapsing this imports region so we have a little more space. And then under the article object, I'm going to start by defining a new constant, and we'll call this getArticleName. GetArticleName is going to take in an object, and then we're going to use the prop function from Crocs to get the name property from it. And this should return us a maybe with that name. And then we're going to use this to get our URL. So let's start defining that. So we'll define a constant called URL, and that's going to equal a call to getArticleName, and we're going to pass in our article object from above. And we'll see that our article name has been wrapped in a just. So let's just verify that this works if name isn't available. So I'll just rename that, and we'll see that we get a nothing. So that's working, but what happens if our name is an empty string? You'll see down here when we call getArticleName, we get a just of an empty string. So we'd like to make sure that there's actually a value in this title before we do any transformations to it. So we're going to update getArticleName to do an extra check. So prop will give us back the property on the object as long as it exists, but it's not going to do any additional checks. So what we want to do is chain another call, and this time we're going to call safe. So it's going to take that property that it got from the object, it'll pass it into chain, which is going to call safe, and we're going to use our isNonEmptyString predicate. That's going to return a maybe of its own, and that's why we use chain here instead of map, so that it flattens that out and we don't get a nested just. So now we'll see we're getting our just with our title, and if I come up here and I make this an empty string, we get a nothing. So now we know that any transformation we apply to adjust is only going to be applied to a valid value. So let's add a map on our URL assignment, and we're going to map our returned article name over our create URL slug function. So now we're going to get back a just with our URL slug. And we want to create a full URL from that slug. So we'll call map again, this time passing it create URL. And you'll see that we get a full URL with our slug wrapped in a just. And now that we've successfully created our URL, we want to unwrap it and just get the string back. So we're going to reach for option here, and for now we'll just pass it an empty string as the default. And you'll see that the result of this is just our URL. If I come up here and I get rid of the name property, we'll get a nothing, and our output is going to be an empty string. Or if I update this, it'll be a default value. Now, in order for the consuming code to continue to work as expected, this default value really should be a URL. So I could hard-code a URL here, but the problem is now that base URL is being duplicated, and if that changes, I have to remember to update it here, and I really don't want to have to do all that. Luckily, the maybe from Crocs gives us an easy way to recover from a nothing. So I'm going to come up here between create URL slug and our map to create URL, and I'm going to call the alt method on our maybe. And alt is actually going to take a maybe, and in the case of a nothing, we're going to get that maybe back, and then it'll continue processing. So I'm going to use maybe, and I'm going to call the of method on that, which is just a constructor that's going to take whatever value we give it and put it into adjust. And I'm going to give this a string, which is going to be a slug for a page not found. And you'll see that now our result is our URL with the page not found slug. So we get a nothing, we skip this mapping, we recover from it, now we have adjust again, so the next map is going to be invoked, which is going to create our URL with this default value. Now we've recovered and this works, but the problem we have now is that we've basically taken this hard-coded value and we're in a position where we have to make sure that this hard-coded value adheres to whatever logic is used in this create URL slug. So a better option would be to move this alt up, and then we can pass it a value that we would expect to be passed through the create URL slug. And then we can run our transformations on that default value. And now we don't have to know about the logic that comes after that. We just know that we're recovering with a reasonable default. The other thing we can do is if this default is going to be applicable anytime we use that getArticleName function, we can move it up there. And then our consuming code doesn't have to worry about recovering at that point in the pipeline. And now that our recovery isn't splitting up our two maps, we can consolidate these using composition. So we can compose and we can call create URL after we call create URL slug. We can get rid of that second map. We can verify that that's still working. And we can make this a little more declarative by cutting this out, moving it into its own utility function. We'll just assign that composition to create URL from name. And then we can use that down here, and everything works and our code's nice and clean. We're importing the maybe type from Crocs, and we're pulling in some functions from a utils file. Our article object is being passed into the getArticleName, which returns a maybe that contains the name property from the article. The alt method recovers from a nothing here by replacing the nothing with a just of the hard-coded value. Then the resulting maybe is mapped over create URL to give us a full URL with the article name as a slug. Instead of using this hard-coded value for our default page name, let's use the AB flag variable that we have here and a function to get that value dynamically. We're going to use the getDefaultPageName function that we've imported from utils. And I'm just going to make a call to that here so we can see what it does. I'm going to pass in the AB flag. And we'll see that the result of this is a function. So passing in our flag is going to result in a function being returned. And that function is going to take no arguments, but when we call it, it's going to give us back our default value. And we'll see if we change this true to a false, we're going to get a different value for our default page name. So now that we understand how this works, let's take this additional call off of here, and we just want to call this with the first argument and get our function back. And let's assign this to a constant. So I'll define a constant here and we'll call it getDefault from nothing. Now that we have this set up, let's see how we can use it to recover from a nothing coming from getArticleName. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to replace this call to alt with a call to a method called coalesce. Now we can see from the error message that we're getting that coalesce requires both left and right functions. Well, what does that mean? What it means is we're going to pass two functions in as arguments. The first one is going to be considered our left, and the second one will be considered our right. The left function will be invoked in the case of a nothing, and the right function will be invoked in the case of a just. In the case of a nothing, we want to recover from this with a value that we're going to get from our getDefaultFromNothing function. So we're going to put that here, and that's going to be our left function. You notice that we have it set up so that getDefaultPageName takes the value ahead of time and returns a function that accepts no values. The reason for that is that when we get a nothing here, we're going to have no value to pass along. So we have to have that ready to go so that we have a function that takes no arguments and returns a value. Now we can define our right function, and in the case of a just, we don't really want to do anything with it yet. So we're going to take that value and we're just going to return it. So we'll define a quick little identity function in line here. Now whatever we return from coalesce is going to be wrapped in a just. So in the case of a nothing, it'll get a value from getDefaultFromNothing, and it'll return that as a just, which means it's going to continue through our transformations. In the case of a just, in this case, we're just passing it through using that identity function on the right. So let's see this work. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to update the article so that we get a nothing from getArticleName. And we'll see that we're getting page not found as our slug. And now if I come down here and I update this to false, you'll see that our slug is now uh-oh, because getDefaultFromNothing is returning a different value based on our AB flag. Now let's say we have a situation where instead of getDefaultPageName, we have a function coming in from our utility, getDefaultPageURL. That's going to return the entire URL instead of just a name that needs transformations. So now we end up in this situation where we recover from the nothing and it still goes through our transformation. So we end up appending a URL to the end of a URL. That's obviously not what we want. So what we can do is we can come down here and instead of passing whatever we get from coalesce through our mapping, we can replace the right with the mapping function itself. So now we're going to recover and we're going to get that URL out, and that's going to be the end of it. But if we go back to a situation where we have our name, then that's going to be passed through our transformation in coalesce and come out the other end as a just. I've defined a function that takes in an object, extracts the name property, and verifies that it's not empty, giving us back a maybe. In the case where this results in a nothing, we use the alt method to recover with a just of nope. Then we apply the createURL utility function to the result and extract the value with the option method. We can see that calling this with the article object results in a URL, and if I set this to an empty object that doesn't have a name property, we'll see that we get the default of nope as our URL slug. I'd like to break this process down into smaller pieces of functionality so I can reuse those pieces and easily create new functions with slight variations. To make this easier, Crocs provides functions that coincide with the maybe methods we're using. These point-free utilities provide the same functionality, but instead of hanging off an instance of maybe, they accept an instance as their last argument. Let's import the functions we need to turn this URL creation process into a function composition. We'll jump up to the top of the file where we're already importing maybe, prop, and safe from Crocs. And then we're going to add compose, because that's what we're going to use to put these together. And then we're going to import functions that represent each of these methods. So if we look at our existing getURL function, we're using chain, alt, map, and option as methods of that maybe instance. We're going to have corresponding point for utility functions to match each of these. So we can pull in chain, alt, map, and option. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to take this existing getURL function and I'm just going to comment that out for reference. And we're going to declare getURL again. And this time it's going to equal a call to compose. And compose is going to get the functions that we need to basically rebuild this functionality using those point-free utilities. So a composition is going to go from right to left. So we're basically going to reverse the order of what we already have. So we're going to start and we're going to say option gets called with default after map is called with createURL. And that happens after our alt with our maybe of our default value of nope, which is being called after chain, and we're chaining our call to safe because it's going to return a nested maybe. So we'll do is non-empty string there. And then that's being called after prop for name. And we're going to leave the object out of it because that's going to be the argument that gets passed in to get URL. So that'll be the first thing. It'll hit this curried version of prop, and that's going to pass those values until we get our URL out on the other side. So we can get rid of these, clean that up, and we'll see that get URL is still working like it did before. If we pass in an object that doesn't have a name, we get our nothing, and it recovers using that alt with a maybe of nope. Now let's say I wanted to be able to get the name in the same exact way for use in other places in my code. Because we're using a function composition here, it's going to be really easy to pull these things apart, make smaller building blocks, and then snap them back together in different ways. So let's start by creating the function that represents this prop and chain combination. So I'm going to cut those, and I'm going to come up here and I'm going to define this, and I'll call it get sluggable name. And this is going to be a composition where I'm just going to use my prop and chain, and then I'm going to call this as the first piece of this composition for get URL. And by putting get sluggable name there, we're right back to where we were, but now we have this reusable piece that we can use in other compositions. So we can do the same thing here where we create our URL and then extract the value. So let's cut these, and I'm going to come up here and I'm going to define another function. I'm going to call this get URL or default, and that's going to equal another composition. And I'm just going to paste those functions in here. So now we have a composition that's going to take a maybe, map it over create URL, and then extract that value with default as a value. And we can put that right back in here. And our original function goes back to doing exactly what it did before. But now it's just 3 functions in a composition, and I have these other 2 functions that are easily reusable in other parts of my code base. So now I can easily reuse these functions to create different compositions. So I can come in here and let's duplicate this, and we're going to call this new copy get URL or nope. And we're going to leave that with the original functionality. We'll come back to that in a second. And we're going to take the alt out of here. Let's say we just want this process where if we get a nothing, we actually show this default value from option. So I can come down here, and if I change this and pass in an object without the name, we'll see that we don't get a URL at all. So now we have the option of doing it with the actual default value from option or doing the version with the recovery. So if I just update this and say, or nope, then we're going to get that version. Or we could come in here and we could create another function, and let's say get URL or whoops. And we'll just change this default value here, and then we can come back down. And now you see we have the same exact functionality except for the recovery step, which we changed. And we didn't have to redefine the portion where we get the name off the object or create the URL and extract the value. We just changed the part that we cared about changing. So now we have more functions, but each one is more specialized, and we can put them together in whatever combination makes the most sense for us. Here we're pulling in maybe, is number, and safe from Crocs. We have 2 maybe numbers defined, and we have an add function. We'd like to get the sum of the 2 numbers with the added safety of the maybe type. The problem is we can't just pass these maybe objects into a function that needs to be applied to numbers, and as we can see, our output is not what we'd like. Normally, we'd use the map method to apply a function to a value that's wrapped in a maybe. Let's get rid of this and see what happens when we use map. So I'm going to call safenum.map, passing it the add function, and let's look at the results. And we'll see we're getting just not a number. The problem is that our map is going to unwrap the value from safenum1 and apply add to it, but add takes 2 arguments, and that second argument is going to get passed as undefined because we don't have a second value available here. So map really only works with functions that have an arity of 1. They only take a single argument. So we can start to fix this by taking add, and we can make that a curried function. So we're going to define it as a function that takes in a, returns a function, that returned function will take in b, and then it'll add our results. We'll see down here that instead of just not a number, we're already getting just function. This means that add was applied to the value in safe num1 and we got a function back. So this gives us something we can work with. We're going to come in here and I'm going to chain on a second map. And this map is going to unwrap the value in the just, which we know is a function, so we'll call that fn. And then I'm going to want to apply that function to the value that's in safe num2, because this is our second number that we want to add together. So I can reference safe num2 here, and then I can use map on that to apply the function that was returned from our previous maybe. Now when we look at the result here, our addition is working, but we have two justs because we've nested maybe, so we can replace this second map with a call to chain, and now we're getting the expected result. This is giving us our desired result, but it's not the most readable code. And we're going to run into this situation more often than you might think. So there's actually a method that's specifically designed for applying a function that's wrapped in a maybe to a value that's wrapped in a maybe. So instead of calling chain to get our function and then map over another value, we can actually just call the app or the AP method here, and we can pass it in our second wrapped value. So we can pass this safe num2, and if we look at the result, we'll see we're still getting our just of 3. So this code is much more readable, so we can get rid of this old code, and we can take this a step further. So since functions in JavaScript are first-class citizens, we can treat them like any other data, which means we can wrap this function in a maybe right out of the gate. So let's define safe add, and that's going to be a function that is wrapped in a just, and we'll do that just by calling maybe.of on add. So now we've lifted our function into the context of a maybe. So now what we can do is come down here and we can reference safe add, and then we can call app on that with safe num1, and then we can call app on it again with safe num2, and we'll get rid of that old implementation and we'll look at the results and we'll get our just of 3. The Crocs library also comes with a utility function that can help us clean this up even more. I'm going to come up here to the top and I'm going to import lift a2 from Crocs. And lift a2 is going to do essentially what we've done here, where we can define safe add, and that'll be a call to lift a2 passing in our curried add function. And that's going to give us back a function that we can pass our maybes into like standard arguments. So now we can call safe add and we can just pass in safe num1 and safe num2. And if we look at the results, we get our just of 3. It's worth noting that the 2 in lift a2 refers to the number of arguments. There's also a lift a3 for functions that require 3 arguments. And again, the value that we've added here is that all of this is going to run safely. So if we ever get an invalid input, we'll see that we're going to get a nothing back. And of course, with a valid value, we'll go to just of our resulting value. We're pulling in a utility function called double that takes in a number and returns the result of doubling it. We've defined an input constant with a value of 2, and we're getting the result of applying double to the input, which gives us 4. If our value isn't a number, we'll get not a number as a result, which probably isn't going to play well with the code that uses this result. Let's use the isNumber and safe functions that we're pulling in from the Crocs library to make a new function which we'll call safe double. Safe double is going to take in our number just like our double utility, but then we're going to call safe, passing isNumber as our predicate, and then passing in n. This is going to give us a maybe of our number. So we'll get a just wrapping our 2 for the case of input, and if we pass something that is not a number, we'll get a nothing. Now we can call map and we can pass in double to apply double to the value that's wrapped in our just. And I'll drop down here and I'm going to replace this call to double with a call to safe double. And you'll see that now we're going to get just 4. Now any code that's using this result is going to expect the number, so we can unwrap this value by calling the option method and passing it a default in the case of a nothing, which will make 0. So now we're going to get our number back out of there. And now if we change the input and we make it a string again, we'll get our default value of 0. Adding safety around an existing function is pretty common, so Crocs gives us a handy utility that we can use to shorten up our code a little bit. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to also import a utility function called safe_lift from Crocs. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to comment out this existing safe double. And we're going to redefine that. And this time I'm going to call safe_lift. I'm going to pass it the predicate that we use to check our type. And then I'm going to pass it the function that I want to put the safety around, which in this case is double. And we'll see down here that everything's back to working. So safe_lift has taken our existing double function, lifted it into the maybe context, and it's using isNumber to check the argument that's passed into it.